Thanks very much for having me here. Good to be with you. Got some notes in front of you. If you didn't get the handout that I left with Jonathan Watt, make sure you get one. Maybe wave frantically or something like that, and he will probably be sure that you can have one. I have found through the years, by the way, that this is one of the most effective of all communication devices. It's probably one of the core keys to intelligent reasoning. The Roman numeral outline in which subordinate points are actually subordinated is so un-PowerPointish, right? One of my Lutheran friends once said, PowerPoint is so easy that any idiot can use it, and almost every idiot does, right? And so this is a very, very useful way of presenting information. It also allows those who are auditors, hapless auditors, to have a sense of where you're going. What you can't tell from looking at it is which of these points I will expand more or less on, because some of them will be sufficiently clear and others a little bit less so. So I'll choose to elaborate where I wish. So you know my title is Whither, Media Ecology. Now I'll say a little bit more about Dr. Ong in a moment. His text was the second text I always used when I taught the media ecology class at Grove City College. We began with Postman, which was more accessible. If you have college students reading Walter Ong, especially the Grove City College students, right, as we all know, the Grove City College students, if they see an author refer to someone, they think they have to know who that someone is. Well, that's 40 people per page with Walter Ong. Right? He's the most densely annotated author I think I've ever read. And the students, their eyes would just bug out, right? They would just freak when they saw that, thinking they had to know it all. So we always introduced them via Postman first because it was so readable that it caught them up with it. And then a week or two later, we would talk about Dr. Ong's book together after that. So what I'm dealing with is the broader question of media ecology. And I'm allowing each of you to address the narrower questions of when oral cultures become writing cultures and what's gained and what's lost with your particular papers then. And so Whither, media ecology will be the task I've assigned myself for today. So a little bit introductorily to me and then a little bit about the title itself. For the last 18 years that I taught at Grove City College before I retired in 21, I taught a course every fall that was an introduction to media ecology. It began in some sense inauspiciously. I taught it for the first time in the fall of 2003. And as some of you will know, both Walter Ong and Neil Postman died that fall. So word got out and they both gave up the ghost. But that was it. They said the little rascal's ruining our discipline, and so they went to fish with Simon Peter after that. So it was one of the most fun courses I ever taught. I loved teaching the course on media ecology. If you see my email address at the top, the reason is I still maintain a media ecology syllabus, including the bibliography, which is now probably 15 pages, and most of it's annotated. So when you're looking for summer reading, you may find that helpful, and I distribute it for free. So if you're interested in that, just email me and ask me, and I'll attach it and send it back to you in case that's of any interest to you. And so I enjoyed teaching media ecology enormously, as would be true for many of you. I was a media ecologist before I knew there was such a term. I think it began when I was reading Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death in a bookstore. Before we had children, we were shopping, and as was our custom in those days, we'd go to some big mall, and my wife would disappear to make sure she stepped foot into everything present. And I would either go to the pub and drink an ale, or I'd go to the bookstore. And so in this case, the bookstore was on the front end of the pub. And so I got there first, and I saw this curious book called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, and I began reading through it. And of course, I read the introduction, as you know from that introduction, where he juxtaposes Orwell and Huxley, and says his thesis is about the fact that it was actually Huxley and not Orwell was right. Not what we hate will destroy us, but what we love will destroy us, right? He had me hooked, and so I started reading the book. And at some point, this gentle woman tapped me on the shoulder and says, "Are you ready to go?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" It happened to be my wife, by the way. No other women have made such overtures. They have better judgment. My wife has good judgment too, sometimes. And so I had like 14 pages left to read. And I said, well, honey, I have to pay for this. After all, I've read all but the 14 pages. And I want those other 14 pages too. It's the only time in my life that I bought a book, because standing in a bookstore, I began to read it, and I couldn't put it down, right? It's that good, and it's still that good. It's a remarkable thing. And within a couple months of reading it, I think I read Daniel Borston's The Image, a guide to pseudo-events in America. This is before he was the Librarian of Congress, but maybe only a few years before he was Librarian of Congress. And having read those two books, I was already a converted media ecologist. I was aware of the fact that part of our environment as humans is the media environment, and that they shape us profoundly regardless of their content. And then later I learned that there was a term to use for this kind of thinking, and it was called media ecology. So I then at some point wrote two little books. Dr. Trout referred to one, Why Johnny Can't Preach. The media have shaped the messengers, and you can see the influence of Marshall McLuhan in the subtitle. The first part of the title goes back to Rudolf Flesch's book in the 1960s, Why Johnny Can't Read, and by 1992, a co-authored book talking Why Johnny Can't Write. And of course, I raised the question as a theologically trained person who had taught at Gordon Conwell Seminary for 14 years or so. I was thinking, a minister's job is to read ancient texts and to compose sermons on those texts. If we are a culture that neither reads nor writes as well as we once did, what does that mean for the Christian ministry? Apart from all the questions of spiritual competence and spiritual health and zeal for the well-being of the Church of Christ and these kind of things, which were true in every generation, what happens if people do not read or write as well today? What does that mean for preaching? And so I wrote that little book at that point. It was interesting. The publishers didn't want to touch it, partly because some of them knew me, and that's the typical response I get. But the other was because it fits no marketing niche. It's not a homiletics textbook, such as Dr. Chappell's book. It's not a how to write a sermon. It's not how to exegete and so forth. And so finally, one of my friends at Crossway said, our people wouldn't touch it. But Marvin Padgett over at P&R is only 2 years away from retirement. If he publishes it and it doesn't sell, they won't fire him anyway. He's safe. Run it by Marvin. And so I did, and Marvin took a chance on it, and it sold reasonably well. And a couple of years later, I did a similar thing with Why Johnny Can't Sing Hymns. Got to be careful how you say that at Geneva College, because I think it's a polemic about exclusive psalmody, which polemic I have offered on that campus before, by the way. So I'm not unwilling to do so, but that's not what I meant. I was talking about how the whole nature of music that surrounds us today has altered the fundamental structure of music itself, and therefore makes anything that isn't commercially mass-produced music not sound like music. And so it is every bit as consequential for the health of the church as Why Johnny Can't Preach, it seems to me. So let me say a word or two about that and why that's important. As you know, the word music is just a Greek word, the Greek word in English letters. Musike is an adjective in Greek, which of course, as the name suggests, means derived from the Muses, the 7 daughters of Athena, who brought poetry and music and other semi-divine things down into this celestial realm and gave them to us. That is to say, music meant, in some sense, almost supernatural. It meant special. And before we could mass produce it in the 20th century, music was designed to take a less formal occasion and make it more formal. When Handel wrote the Candos anthems for the Duke of Candos, they were all musical settings of psalms, written in 4 parts and with male sopranos, because James, the Duke of Candos, preferred the sound in chorus of male sopranos to female sopranos. It was a smaller, lighter sound, and it blended with the other 3 parts well. Then, of course, his music for the royal fireworks was also for the coronation of royalty in England and so forth. And so music was inherently sublime. It was inherently sublime until the period of 1890 to 1930, which is now referred to as the Revolution in Music, referred to by David Sweisman in Wilmington, Delaware, as the commercial revolution in music. Prior to that period of roughly 1890 to 1930, player pianos, the early gramophones, radio broadcasts, and so forth. Prior to that moment in human history, all music had a human attached. And the most basic form of music that most people experienced from Adam until 1890 was what we now call folk music, which has disappeared. The only residue of folk music in our culture today that remains is when the church gathers on the first day of the week to sing praise to God, and the people sing their own. Now, I know in some churches they don't do that, and they have a praise team up front. I always ask those people, I thought the congregation was the praise team. And they say, well, these are the praise leaders. And the congregation do these kinds of things, right? And so now we have performers even in the church, because we've lost the sense of people producing their own music. So that period from 1890 to 1930 is addressed by two books that were not in print when I wrote Why Johnny Can't Sing Hymns. And my book would have been better if those books had been there. So they are Mark Katz, K-A-T-Z. He was at UNC Chapel Hill at the time. Shortly after the book arrived, he moved to Baltimore, and he's now in the Peabody Conservatory of Music at Johns Hopkins University. But he was at UNC Chapel Hill at the time when he wrote it. And his was called Capturing Sound. And then about a year or two later, 2010 I think it was, which is when mine showed up, David Sweisman at the University of Delaware in Wilmington, he wrote Selling Sounds, the Commercial Revolution in Music. Neither had met the other, neither knew the other was working on it, but the two of them together indicated that once you could capture sound, so that it didn't need to have a human attached, you see, you could mass produce it. Now, how do you mass produce it? You mass produce it to make money. How do you make money? By having as few instrumental people involved and producing the stuff cheaply, right? And so what happens then is the introduction of mass music changed the human experience of music, because something that was once sublime was now the most mundane thing we encountered every day. If I drive over to the Sheets, I can't drive to the Sheets right now because I've still got 3 broken bones in my ankle, and the surgeon threatens to send me off to Siberia if I step on it and put any weight on it. But if I were to go to Sheets a month and a half from now, if I get to where I can drive the Mustang GT again, if I go to Sheets, while I'm doing something so mundane as putting gasoline into the car, there's this music. If I go into the Sheets and get a soda of some sort, that music is there in the background. If I go into the men's room and do something even more inconsequential and less sublime, the music is there also. So what commercial music did is it robbed us of the sublimity of music. It was once sublime, and that's what musike means in Greek. I still remember the second time we were in Pittsburgh listening to the Ein Deutsches Requiem. I've now heard it live in Heinz Hall 3 times. It's a wonderful piece of music. The second time we heard it, we noticed before the program began, several Grove City students seated 2 or 3 rows behind us. I had mentioned to them in my classes, all of my classes probably, that it's one of the finest pieces of music that people don't listen to. It's extraordinary. So the lights go down, and the conductor comes out, and the bass is way back on the far right. It looked like a mahogany convention back there. I think there were 5 each of the string basses and cello. And I went to the pocket, probably not that one, but this one, and I found a remedy, right? And so I began to wipe the tears away, knowing what was coming. And later, 7 movements later, as it ended, I noticed that I hadn't put the handkerchief back in my pocket. I feared I might need it again, and the fear was justified. So when the lights came up at the end of the program, several of the students came by. I saw Mrs. Gordon be there, and one of them said, "Oh, Dr. Gordon, do you have a little cold? I said, no, Rachel, I have a little Brahms. Right? It was sublime. Right? It was absolutely 80 wonderful voices doing their respective four parts. 60 or 70 trained professionals doing theirs. It was sublime. And it was not like putting gas in the car at Sheets. Right? So I mention that because when we deal with media ecology, you and I and others, we normally deal with communication media in the ordinary senses of language spoken, language written, and so forth. But music was also a form of human mediating reality to one another, and that particular medium has all but disappeared once we had commercial music. And real music can hardly compete with it anymore. People's sensibilities have been trained to hear the repetitive, banal realities of commercial music, and they don't know what to do with music that's actually. So those are some things about me. My understanding of media ecology, as you can see here, is that the fundamental premise of media ecology is also the premise of those who do cultural anthropology. We make tools, and tools make us. We shape our tools, and our tools shape us. When we added a room to our home in Massachusetts, when we first went to build the condo, I decided to put a deck on the back, 14 by 10, afterwards. And as I was figuring out, there'd be a 14-foot plate going into the foundation, no problem there. And I could easily measure 14 feet across out there and bring two 10-foot strings out there. But how did I keep it from going counterclockwise, right? I didn't want a trapezoid. If you ever build anything that has to be square, it is a deck. Right? There's too many lines on there that will give it away if it isn't. And so I had to figure out how do I get this right. So somehow I remember 10th grade trig or something like that. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. So I had 10-foot lines, 14-foot lines, and all I had to do was to measure the diagonals until they were the same. Didn't matter what the absolute number was. When the diagonals were the same, she was square, and then I could start shoveling, put a sonotube in there, pour concrete in, and I had my foot around. So my wife comes out at this time as I'm shoveling away. She says, "What are you making?" And I said, as a good media ecologist, calluses. We make tools, and tools make us. And we make tools to do one thing, and they always do other. Now, calluses is not a value judgment. If you're a concert violinist, it might be. If you are a competitive handballer, calluses is exactly what you want. The ball comes off your hand a lot faster if the hand is hard than if the hand is soft. And so whether you want calluses or not is your own business, but a simple fact of the matter is if you shovel enough, unless you're a lecturer, if you shovel enough, you will get calluses. It goes with the territory. That's the fundamental premise of media ecology. And so its fundamental assumption is it's not how we use tools that shapes us, it's how they use us that shapes us. And the media ecologist is always asking the question is, how does my exposure to this thing shape me? After all, these things are all part of the material order, and I am part of the material order. You are part of the material order, right? And so when any part of the material order connects with another part of the material order, it will leave some effect. And so when I ask people, why do you speak English? The two wrong answers I routinely get. The first one, in no particular order, the first is, what's wrong with English? I didn't say what's wrong with English. I said, why do you speak English? I actually think, as far as I can tell, it's a pretty good language, right? And it's spoken by many people and has a good literature, right? So I think English is fine. But you see the defensive reaction. And I say, why do you speak English? And the answer is, what's wrong with English? The second answer is, everybody speaks English. Well, there are 3 billion Chinamen who would disagree with that. And probably as many Indians who would disagree with that. And so there are several world languages spoken more frequently than English, and so people are not stuck speaking it. They speak it, but think of the influence that has on them. If you were reared in Germany, as a child, you probably would have read Goethe. But here, or in the Great Britain Isles, we read Shakespeare. Maybe in France, they read Proust. And so when you think of the value of the books that you read, the literature you've been exposed to in your life, the language in which you read it is remarkable. Now, we say we read Tolstoy. We don't really. I read Anna Karenina, but I read an English translation of Anna Karenina, and I understand that the woman who then translated Dostoevsky the same way, whereas anyone who studies Slavic languages says Dostoevsky and Tolstoy are very different. But in her translations, they come out the same. Different sort of thing. So to be a media ecologist then is to recognize the effect that media have on human experience, much more importantly than what we do with them, how they shape us, so that we hear English natively now. This is why the computer-generated English is so amusing, right? I'm not saying amusing because here I can't say damnable. So I'll say amusing, right? Because the computer-generated stuff goes syllable by syllable and gets it right, but it has no sense of the sound of English. The computer-generated stuff has an uncanny capacity to put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Couldn't do that with chewing gum. I'll leave it at that. What happens is a native listener to English doesn't hear syllable by syllable. We hear word by word and phrase by phrase and clause by clause and paragraph by paragraph. And native users use the language differently than non-native users. Only a machine would think there is such a thing as machine language. There is nothing about that is humane itself. So today what I'd like to chat about a little bit is I'd like to just echo, for instance, President Trump's comments about the interrelated character of media ecology. That I'm glad I retired when I did, because I'm assuming eventually media ecology will have a larger footprint than the Academy does today. And when it does, some dean or provost is going to ruin it for all of us. They will have to decide, is it a humanity or is it over on the sciences, math, and technology side? What is it, right? And so it's going to get pushed into one direction or another, whereas right now it's the most delightful free-for-all out there. All sorts of people write about it. So I just mentioned some of them, right? So you've got philosophers such as Socrates, who objected to writing, as you know, in the Phaedrus Dialogue, which we only know about because his disciple Plato disagreed with him and recorded the dialogue for it. So that's one of life's more delicious ironies, I suppose. We have literary types, both Walter Arlen and Alfred McClure were literary types, you know. And so literary types do this kind of a thing. We have, you see I put it in quotation, educationist, because Postman would not call himself an educator. He called himself an educationist, someone who thinks about the process. He says you don't educate people. If they don't want to learn, they don't learn. So he wouldn't use educate as a verb. But he could call himself an educationist because he thought about the whole process there. So he's definitely the end there. Marianne Wolf and others who are behaviorists are involved in the discipline. Jean Twenge out at San Diego State University. She is a practicing clinical psychologist. Sherry Turkle is a sociologist who's worked at MIT under Joseph Weizenbaum for over 40 or 50 years. And she deals with the intersection of technology and humanity. And so there's this and even polymath Jesuit Catholic priests such as Walter Arlen. Got to put Walter Arlen in there. So what I'd like to chat about today is the apparent cultural progress of media ecology recently and its actual non-progress. So let me qualify what I mean by cultural. Speaking as a media ecologist, I don't think we're making any real progress. Conversion to media ecological ways of thinking is almost like religious conversion. For those who've been converted, it's obvious. And when they talk to other converted people, they know they're on the same page. For slightly more secular people, they probably refer to it as paradigm shift, using the language of Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where the way science makes its progress is someone proposes a new paradigm, a new way of viewing data, and then for a long period of time, things are pretty steep and they're doing a lot, and then it starts to level off because we've exhausted that paradigm, and off it goes. So it's not like an escalator, it's more like steps. This is the point. And when there's a new paradigm, everything changes. And so Louis Pasteur and others say there's a universe on your fingertip. That changed everything, right? That's when when Aristotle looked outside during a lunar eclipse we had under Aristotle looked outside one time and looked at the shadow of the Earth on the moon and noticed that it was round. So this was not Copernicus. This was much of a long kind of thing. Madame Curie, God bless her, right? Was only 53 years old when she died of radiation poisoning. She saved your life, for many of you, mine when I had stage 3 cancer in 2004. Think of how frequently we get x-rays, and that little woman introduced us to a new reality, introduced 2 new elements to the periodic chart, the first woman to get a Nobel Prize, and the first human to get 2. What a remarkable, remarkable lady. And everything changes when you can look inside of a human without using your pocket knife or something else to do so, right? And so that's the structure of scientific revolutions. And for those who are on a new paradigm, they see everything through that paradigm. Converted people see everything through what it's like to live a life of faith. And so for people who, quote, get it, who understand and get media ecology, we can't unget it. That's a chalkboard with non-erasable chalk. Right? You see it for the rest of your life. You're aware of it everywhere. You see it everywhere. I was playing around in the Acts of the Apostles Greece down at a plot, and I noticed in Acts 8 that Philip had seen a person in a chariot, and he was reading from Isaiah. We know it was Isaiah 53. He just says from Isaiah, and it raises the question of who was the prophet talking about, himself or someone else. That's what all normal people ask when they read Acts 8. But I'm not a normal person, right? What I asked was, how did he get his hands on a manuscript of Isaiah, right? How in the world in a day like that, when they hand copied these things on animal skins and papyrus, terribly expensive, how could he get access to it? And the text tells us what his job was. What was his job? He was the keeper of the treasury of Candace, the queen. So it'd be like working at MoMA and bringing some modern art home for a cocktail party. He had a manuscript and could read it and ask questions about it, which no one in the first century could privately own. Now see, all normal people read that and merely ask, what did Isaiah read? Right? Media ecologists say, how did he get his hands on a manuscript? Right? He's a driver. Speaking of drivers, my thanks are today are to my friend who brought me down here. And he's a former military judge advocate. And he was willing to take time off of his doctoral program at Westminster in Philadelphia to bring me down today because I can't drive yet. And so I appreciate his doing so. And he's also involved in prison ministry here in Western Pennsylvania, which I think is appropriate. Because remember, with military JAGs, they have to learn to prosecute or defend. The officiating judge will assign the assignment to people, and they have to be able to do both. So when Rob Ramey goes to a local prison here to visit, he might have put some of those people in there, and he might get some of them out. So it's a good thing for him to do. And before he left and retired from the military in 2015, by the way, he had reached the rank of colonel. So I would say that the odds are very good that I today have the highest ranking chauffeur in modern military history. I've got a colonel driving me back and forth from Grove City to here. So I wanted to raise the question, is it progress that Jonathan Haidt could write the book that came out almost 2 summers ago now? The Anxious Generation. He had written earlier with Greg Lukianoff, and he's a very good author, and you can tell he's widely read in every field, but also in media ecology. And so my family asked me, does this make you happy because you're seeing someone saying the things that you've been boring us with for 20 years? And I said, well, I don't like to lose cornering the market on boring. I kind of like it. And I've had the market to myself. But I said, no, he's not really doing media ecology. He's doing the result of media ecology and of other things. I still don't think the number of people who really get media ecology is any greater than it was 20 years ago. and I'll explain that in a minute. So is it cultural progress that there are some school boards that are now not permitting young people to bring their smartphones in? You bet. That is progress. Is it cultural progress in the sense that people now actually understand and embrace media ecology? I doubt it. And I'll give you some 5 reasons why I think that's the case. So I don't think that many people were persuaded because they are persuaded in media ecology. They were persuaded by the reasoning in Jonathan Haidt's book. Whereas for those of us who are media ecologists, we predicted all 3 things 20 years ago, almost 25. By the time the smartphone appeared in 2005, we all said this will have 3 effects on young people. It will slow down, it will retard their intellectual and cognitive processes. It will retard their social progress and development, and it will create in them all sorts of mental illnesses and anxieties, because they are no longer around stable adults who could kind of be something that you played off of to find your way through adolescence and beyond, but now they're around equally unstable adolescents. And that's a boat with no anchor and no dock to which one needs to moor. And sure enough, 20 years later he says this, and now that he has empirical proof, people listen. So I am glad that there are school systems now that take the smartphones away from young people when they come in each day. I think that's great for them that that's the case. But I don't think they're doing it because they get media ecology. I think it's because Jonathan wrote the book that he did when he did. And so he's been informed by media ecology, and his book has been widely read. And as a great shock to me, there are school systems in the United States today who do not permit kids to bring smartphones to class. So some of them don't let them bring them on campus. Others have tiny little boxes with the student's name on them, and they come in the morning and they deposit them. That way, if they need to call their parents to take them to a soccer practice, after the bell goes, they can call the parents. So they're there, but they can't take them with them to the classroom and ruin their educational experience by the constant distraction of your smartphone. This is great progress. But I still don't think that many people have embraced media ecology. So here's some of the reasons I think not many people have actually embraced it. First, if media ecology had been embraced by others, they would have done what all of us told them to do 20 years ago. All right? And they didn't. They needed other kinds of convincing things. What's perfectly obvious to a media ecologist is not obvious to people who are not yet converted to media ecologists. And second, the empirical method is still the one commonly referred to way of discovering truth in our culture today. I mentioned Ryan Burge's article recently, just a week or 2 ago, on when people make decisions, what sources do they go to? And the most common source in our culture, religious and non-religious and so forth, is empirical studies. And so empirical studies still rule roost. And yet the problem with empirical studies is that they are subject to political whims. They are expensive, and they are time-consuming. So in the early aughts, in 2004, our first daughter was born and died of leukemia when she was 14 weeks old. The conversations before Congress were then, should we spend more money on AIDS research or more money on children's cancer research? Well, you can guess what I prefer probably at that point. However, dead children had a very small lobby at that time. Aggressively, homosexual men had a very loud political voice, and so they got what they wanted. Right? That's just the nature of most empirical studies. Neither you nor I nor anyone else in this room has enough money to conduct much empirical investigation on your own. Someone has to authorize monies to be expended for it to be done, and that's totally at the whim of whoever is popular at the time, who has Congress's ear. Second is it's expensive. Doing it is very, very expensive. For it to be valid, it has to be reproducible and reproduced. And third, empirical research is still extremely time-consuming. Yet all media ecologists knew 20 years the effects of smartphones on the development of young people. And for us, it was just obvious that it would have these results, but we hadn't demonstrated it yet by longitudinal studies. When I was doing my cancer treatments, Mary was lost in '86, so my cancer treatments were 2004. I had a 25% chance of surviving stage 3 cancer. And at one point, Eileen came in. She was a social worker, I think, at Allegheny General. And she said, "Mr. Gordon, would you be willing to participate in a longitudinal study?" I said, "Eileen, with a 25% chance of survival, the longitudinaler, the better." Right? I said, "Give me one of them 10-year programs, baby." I'll go for that, right? Don't you have a 40-year program you want me to work on? That would be wonderful. And so the point is, if you're waiting for empirical results, you have to take 20 years of children being mistreated before you can get the job done. And so that's what happened. So then a third reason that the immediate ecological discipline remains largely unrecognized is because of the persistent naivete regarding attention span. As early as 1971, business people were talking about the attention economy. And they were saying in the early days of punch card reading computers, for instance, they were saying in those early days that information is no longer a valuable commodity. It's an inexpensive commodity. The valuable commodity is attention. To determine which information to give your attention to. And Mr. Goldhaber reiterated that in 1997. So business people know this. They've been talking about it for 40 and 50 years now. And so what happens is people don't realize that to which we give our attention shapes our attention. What Gordon attends to today influences what he can attend to tomorrow. And so with many other animate forms of life, we have alarming attention and orienting attention. If a deer is rehabilitated by the DCNR here in Pennsylvania, they let him out in the forest. He's listening for anything that sounds threatening, and he's smelling for water, because they eat water too. Americans, we have executive attention. We walk downhill. When I'm in the forest and I want water, I go down. I've learned this clever reality. Water goes downhill. And so if you're looking for water, that's what you do. The deer has no idea whether it's uphill or down. But his nose is turned inside out. It's a better nose than you and I have. And he can smell it. And so he looks for what they call his orienting attention. Anything that survives in forest, including our hunter-gatherer ancestors, learns to have alerting or alarming attention. That we notice anything and we respond to it suddenly. And if we don't, in a forest full of predators, we could be predated. And so, like those other creatures, our brain actually releases certain pleasure chemicals to us whenever we flipped our attention from one thing to another. Because the species that did that survived. And that's why people used to, quote, watch television. That's why some of them watch the internet, you see. They're not watching a particular program, not watching a particular video. They're just watching anything that moves. So the camera didn't really affect the human race in a negative way. Moving pictures did. Because they created and cultivated in us a desire for the constant stimulation that rewards us biochemically. They are literally addictive. They are chemically addictive. That's what moving pictures actually do to us. So many people have written about this. I love the volume that came out in 2008, Distracted, The Coming Dark Age. It's a wonderful, wonderful read, and she outlines these three basic forms. Only the human is capable of executive attention, but the human has to develop it. It doesn't develop naturally, and we get no biological reward for developing executive attention span. We have to do it because we think there's some humane value to it, and so we develop it because we think there's a reason to. All of the literature on attention is really remarkable and fascinating, but horribly disturbing, because we live in a highly distracted culture. And Maggie Jackson's book remains even more important now than it was when she wrote it. And so treat yourself to those kinds of things. And of course, others written about this. Nicholas Carr, Mark Bauerlein, and tons of people are writing about the distracted nature of the digital world and what that does to our attention span. Treat yourself to those kinds of things. And then I think an additional reason that the conversion hasn't taken place societally is because the commercial forces are so invested in moving pictures. And they will not, with Bill and Thomas, go gently into that good night. They are not about to give up all the money that comes from our consuming what they produce. And so we face enormous commercial hurdles when we say, you know, I think I'd rather finish reading Plato's dialogues than I would watch YouTube. Right? That dog don't hunt. Not in our culture. Not in our culture. And then the fifth of these, my point E, this is only mine. I haven't read this from anyone else, so it's probably wrong. But I'll share it with you, and you can talk about it with each other or dismiss it. Why pay attention to a man who's a one-legged bow tire? I think that our sense of self is an uncanny faculty. When you think of your earliest memories from childhood, I have one from sitting beside my grandmother who died when I was less than 2 years old. And it doesn't look to me like a photograph. I still see her, a woman with a floral dress, seated on the concrete steps of that front porch in Central Virginia with a white apron, and she was picking peas or digging beans or something. I didn't know. I was a year and a half old, right? But in other words, I don't see myself as an object in a photograph. I see the experience from the inside. And this is essential to our being moral beings. Because if I discover tomorrow that I offended Dr. Trout, I am still responsible for having done so. And it is my moral duty to contact him and to ask him to forgive me. And so our sense of the self as contiguous, you see, is essential to the image of God in us. That I am the person I was. But some people would say, I'm a little different. I didn't know any Greek when I was 18 months old. Couldn't tie a bow tie, right? So I'm a little different, not much taller, but I'm a little different. But I still have a sense that that was I, right? The sense of ego, of self, is critical to our being moral beings. And so because of that, you and I don't realize when moving pictures have made us different humans than we used to be. Because the change is gradual. And we still think I is I. Ego is ego. And we don't realize it's not the same ego that was once here. Now sometimes when you read editorials and essays, you'll find an author saying, I was looking forward to our family trip to the beach and looking forward to those rare rainy days when I would be guiltlessly inside with a cup of coffee and a good book. And so when the rainy day came and I poured a cup of coffee, I sat down to read, and after 2 pages my mind wandered and I couldn't follow it anymore. I was a YouTuber. I was a gamer. And I didn't have the attention span that once brought me so much joy. And so you can talk about that. I'm probably crazy, but I actually think that's a fifth reason. I think the sense of the ego is always being ego. Resist saying you aren't the same ego you used to be. You're just as morally accountable as you used to be. You're still responsible for what you've done, for what you say. But you're not you. You're not that you. You're a different you than you might have been before. And I think the reason it's hard for people to convert to immediate ecological outlook is they don't realize that they are like Tennyson's Ulysses, a part of all that I have seen. Right? Ever roaming with an eager heart. Right? Much have I seen in heaven. Right? So we are part of all that we have seen, all that we've experienced. But the sense of self resists that acknowledgement. And until some kind of a breakthrough moment occurs, we don't realize that we can't curl up with a good book anymore. We might even realize I haven't said curl up with a good book in 3 years. Right? So I had another little experience last week. Diane was keeping the granddaughter one day over here in Franklin Park. And so she lets me once a week look out for myself. I don't sleep too well because the pain's not great. At 6 a.m. I woke up and it wasn't light yet at 6 a.m. and the house was empty and dark. But I think as I looked out the window to the east, it was getting lighter. And I opened up and decided to listen to the King's Singers. And the six of them sang, of all things, Met Bidler's song, The Rose, which I had never paid any attention to, partly because Met Bidler sang it. And they sang it beautifully. The 6 parts were so lovely that as I watched the video, I couldn't tell which of the 6 was singing which part. And I listened to it several times, and I wept for 10 minutes. Because when no one was looking, the Sublime entered 213 Edgewood Avenue in Grove City. And I was glad it did. And so I sent a link to it to my wife, my 2 daughters, and our sons-in-laws, and said, wait to this, right, kind of a thing. So the human still has the capacity to retain the appreciation of the sublime, but we live in a culture that doesn't appreciate it and tends to leave us on our own to find it where we can. So thanks for letting me introduce your discussions. Sorry I can't be with you for the rest of the time here because my surgeon wants me to get my foot up where it belongs at some point. So thank you for having me and for your kind attention.